Welcome back. This is our lecture on the cultures of Mesopotamia. Again, the items in red are the ones to look out for. I've included several other examples just to give you a better context for the artwork that we'll be studying, but we're looking at cultures that rise in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the river valleys, what we sometimes refer to as the Fertile Crescent. Are essentially city-states that are controlled by the most powerful of the city-states at any given time. So different cultures or different city-states would rise to prominence throughout the period of the ancient Mesopotamians. At the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys here in what is now modern-day Iraq and portions, of course, of Iran as well. So the first culture that we'll look at is the Sumerian culture. They are the inventors of the first known form of written language, which is cuneiform. The cuneiform is a language system that evolves from a pictographic system, which you see toward the left, and eventually evolves into a system that resembles the types of characters we associate with individual words or letters. Cuneiform was initially done by incising pointed tool, and then later a stylus was developed that had a triangular shape, and that would be pressed into the clay, and that's where we get the term cuneiform. In fact, it comes to us from the Latin term for wedge, which refers to the shape of the stylus itself. The ruins of are often discovered under large mounds of earth that have built up over time on top of them. Those are often referred to locally as tells, tepes, or hyokes. So you will sometimes see those names associated with any individual site. The first site to look at, or the first object for us to look at, is a female head that was uncovered in Uruk, and she possibly represents a goddess, most likely Inanna, whose name later became Ishtar. She's the goddess of multiple facets, but particularly of love and of war. The figure itself is incomplete. She would probably have had a wooden remainder of her head, the head flattish on the back, so the rest of the head and body would definitely have been included there. She is complete in two senses. Not only is she missing body, but there are elements of her that are missing as well. You see that kind of single unified eyebrow that is incised into the face. That would have been inlaid, as would have been the eyes. She also has a cleft at the top of the head that would have likely to some form of wig or headdress. So this is a potential recreation of what she should have looked like. So the emphasis on the eyes, especially the eyes being really large and open, is something we'll see quite a lot of here in ancient Mesopotamia. Another Sumerian piece that we spend some time with is the Vodka Vase, and it is a fully three-dimensional piece, so you're seeing three views of it from different figures and animals moving around the vase. And you notice that that movement happens in opposite directions as we move upward. The are moving on the screen here from left to right. The next register up, the figures are moving from right to left, and the register above that, we again left to right. So it sort of spirals in a series of what we call registers. So the registers are pretty important for us to understand. They are essentially bands of visual information, usually carving in relief, and those often depicted in levels. So each individual register can be seen as kind of a separate portion of the story. More often than not, the bottom of each register also equates to what we call the ground line. So the ground line and the register are really two ideas. The register is the band of storytelling itself. You could almost think of it as like the box surrounding a cartoon or but at the bottom of that band is what we refer to as the ground line, and that's the line that the figures appear to stand on. So seem to be stacked one on top of the other, like separate stories in a tall building, we can think of the earth itself as being actually the baseline on which the figures stand in each of those registers. We see several things happening here also that show the level of importance of each band. You may notice that there's smaller bands at the bottom and they get larger as we go upward. We have all hierarchy of importance being depicted here as well. We've got plants and vegetation at the bottom register, animals in the second register. Is much taller, and that shows everyday people in a procession bringing votive offerings to the temple of Inanna, the temple of the goddess. And the top level is much larger still, and this includes figures who are far more important. The goddess Inanna is receiving the votive offerings. Now, votive offerings could be a number of different things. A votive is something that is meant to be left, displayed, or before a statue, or before the presence of a god, and it's meant to remain there. You take it and leave it so that it does some continued praying for you, in a sense. It stays in place to continue to offer your deference to a god or to a goddess. So we see lots of different votive offerings throughout ancient Mesopotamia. One of the most interesting, I think, are the figures discovered in Tel Asmar. These are found buried under the floor of a temple discovered at what is now called Tel Asmar. So we could call these the Ashuna figures or the Tel Asmar figures. And they are a group that have been discovered to this point, very similar figures and similar poses. They are more or less cylindrical from the waist down and flattened in the torso and head, but all of them have their hands clasped against their stomachs or chests. They would have held themselves, act as offerings. They could be seen as votives in their own right. They are meant to be seen, so to speak, from the view that you're seeing here, but of course they would be facing a statue of the goddess. So really the goddess is the one who's meant to see them from the angle that we're looking. And they represented the people who placed them there. So you could almost think of them as standing in for you, so that you are continually offering your prayers and your reverence to this particular goddess. That's another reason why the eyes are so prominent. It's really important. Be very much aware and attentive, and as if they are unblinkingly staring at and revering this particular god. The figures are mostly male, although there are some female figures there as well. And they range in size from just a few inches to about 30 inches. When you get really close to them, you can see how almost over the top the emphasis is on the eyes to really make them feel that they are unwavering in their attention to their job, to revering the goddess. You can also see in this that the figure is holding a cup that could hold liquid libations. So you could add kind of offerings to the goddess there that he basically hold for you and offer to her. The Sumerians also invented this technique of creating imagery almost in a combination of sculpture. These are known as cylinder seals, and the cylinder seal is a cylinder that's carved and then pressed into soft clay and rolled, and as it rolls across that surface, it produces a relief shape. So the figures are carved into the cylinder, into the clay, that makes the clay around the figures depressed, and the clay that would then be into the forms, the negative shapes of the carved figures, then stands forward in relief in the clay. We've also found a lot of from the Sumerian culture in burial chambers, and that's where this object comes from, the so-called royal cemetery of the city of Ur. And the city of Ur has multiple burial locations, and within those burial sites, objects have been discovered that we know not as perhaps historians really like. For instance, this object has become known as the Standard of Ur. Now, a standard is like a flag symbol that's carried into battle at the front of a group of soldiers. You may have heard of the phrase a standard bearer, someone who's carrying the flag or the of the kingdom that is represented by that army. So there's some belief that this may have been carried on poles into battle, but is completely sure of that. In fact, the object itself is hollow, so some people believe that it may in fact have been like a sounding board or sounding box for some instrument. Regardless, we do see the Sumerian tradition of depiction in registers, just like we did the Vodka Vase, and you can see on both sides there are pretty elaborate scenes of human beings going about a variety of different activities. This side now is referred to as the peace side and may in fact be a celebration that's happening after the battle scene on the opposite side. You can see again that there is a hierarchy. The people and animals at the lower section, especially people carrying things that are probably offerings to the king or objects that are going to be used in the celebration. You can also see that these people are at a smaller scale, certainly, than the figures here who are seated. If they were to stand up, they'd be taller than the register that they are in. And even within this group of obviously figures who are than the people performing for them, like the musicians and singers, we see one figure who's larger still. That's the king. So we have what we to as the hierarchy of scale. Now, hierarchy we think of as people within an organization who are of different levels of power, and the highest person in the hierarchy, of course, in this case would be the king. We refer to the way that the figures are depicted at different scales hierarchical as well. That way you can tell someone's importance based on the size of the representation and how much space they occupy. To know, or the section rather, to know of the standard of Ur from the for the purposes of the test is the opposite side, the war side, and it does have some interesting aspects in that there's more action and movement in some of the animals, and even expression in the figures of the slain they're fighting against than in the rigidity of the figures in the army itself. So it's not unusual for us to see kind of solidity and upright rigidity in the figures of a victorious culture, and a little bit more expression in the figures that culture has defeated. We'll see that in examples even all the way into ancient Greece. You can clearly hear that the artist is having some fun in depicting the mechanisms of war. You can see that there's a lot of attention paid to how the horses are connected, and you can see that there's sort of symbolism in the fact that they're fighting more, of course, than just these four figures that you around. Obviously, those figures are symbolic representations of multiple others. You can see the success of the army forward in a very unified fashion, and in the top register you see them bringing their defeated prisoners of wars or slaves to be presented to the king. It's also interesting to notice that the king is so large, in fact, that his head does actually go just a little bit above the boundaries, the decorative border register that he's in, and that happens on both sides. In fact, if we back up, you can see his head pops up here into the frame as well. Another object discovered in the burial chambers in Ur is this bull-headed lyre. Now, the head itself and that forms the front is original, and what you're seeing here in wood is reconstruction. We believe this is what the instrument would have looked like. Possible that the story that's being depicted is that of one of the first pieces of ancient literature we could look at, the story of Gilgamesh. Fought at one point scorpion men, and you can clearly see a male scorpion hybrid here at the bottom. But these bearded animals, actually horned animals, are pretty prevalent throughout the art of Mesopotamia. You can see the hero at the top defeating animals that look like bulls with human heads. So perhaps a reference here to that same part of the story. The next big culture to rise after the Sumerian is the Akkadian. So if you look at the map here, you can see the Sumerian culture centered in and around Ur and Ur cities becomes kind of submerged into a larger empire, the Akkadian Empire. After the Akkadian, there's a rise of the Sumerian culture for a second time, and then Babylon becomes the dominant city. So we have several here. This is a piece that's kind of important for us, I think, when we think about literature and the connection to art. This is a piece honoring the daughter of Sargon I. She was a high priestess and a poetess. She's the first named author in the history. So the piece honors the very first person to write poetry or literature of any kind and have their name ascribed to writing. So she becomes sort of the first known author in the world. The Akkadian culture is a little more stoic in the presentation. You can certainly see that there's a continuation of that stylized curly cues and patterns in beards, which we've seen, and that eyebrow ridge, and of course on these inlaid eyes. This is a pretty remarkable piece from the Akkadian culture. It is life-sized, and it is an example of casting, and it's hollow core casting, which is really sophisticated and to master. What would normally be done would be a construction of the original image that you're trying to recreate in metal in clay and wax around a core of plaster or some other material. Then a mold is made around the entire form, and pins are pushed through that wax or clay into the core inside, and those are left exposed so that they can be attached to this outer mold as well. So at one point you'd have a very solid mass of an outer mold, the wax of the figure, its inner mold. That would have to be heated, at which point the wax would all melt out of it. That's why you have those pins there to keep this inner core and obscuring parts of your design. Then the entire piece would be filled with liquid metal, in this case bronze. What's in that space then is filling in all of the indentations and the decorative aspects of the original wax. Once it's cooled, outer mold is broken away, the pins are trimmed down, you can even cut inside and remove that inner core. It creates a really use of materials to have a hollow casting, because then of course you're not having to waste a ton of material to fill in all this space on the inside. It makes the sculpture less bulky in terms of its weight. It's a little easier to manipulate. The figure itself is life-sized. He is all that remains of what would have been a full figure as well. So again, we have to kind of speculate what the rest of the sculpture might have looked like. Painting piece for us is the victory stele of Naram Sin. Now he is in this piece recording his victory over the Nubi people. He is definitely proclaiming himself to be the master of this region and an important ruler in his own right, but he's depicted, the artist has chosen to depict him in a way that's a little different from what we've seen in the Sumerian culture. We don't really see registers per se. We see in a natural landscape. Now they are still kind of in vaguely horizontal, or in this case diagonal groupings, one on top of the in strict horizontal bands. They seem to be moving upward on this mountain, and it does divide somewhat in half. Most of Naram's soldiers are on the left, his enemies are here over to the right, and you can see that they're depicted again as the soldiers on his side very much the same, very much in order and rigid control. The expression comes in the dead and dying bodies of his defeated enemies. You can see Naram Sin is wearing a horned crown, so those bull horns become very much a symbol of the king. You can see he's associating himself with either stars or double suns, which most likely represent his gods. We know that these victories are pretty prevalent throughout the ancient world, and they are known collectively as stele, essentially carved relief sculptures, usually that are taller than they are wide, and they're almost always in relief. Some of them have been kings, and that's the case that happens here with Naram-Sin. One of his, the word I'm trying to say, a king after him dedicates this stele to himself. So at one point, an Elamite king, this is an image of his own victory. And that happens actually quite frequently in Egypt and in Rome as well. The stele that we'll encounter throughout this Unit 1, probably the two most important ones to be aware of are Naram-Sin's and Hammurabi's, and we'll deal with Hammurabi in a moment. After the Akkadians fall, Sumeria rises again, so we can refer to this as Neo or New Sumeria, and that brings us to a particular time that's prevalent in Mesopotamia as well, the ziggurat. The ziggurat is somewhat similar to a pyramid, although they are distinct, different from different cultures and have very different purposes. Generally, the ziggurat acts almost more like a series of plateaus with ramps leading from the ground upward, and the temple would be on top. Neo-Sumerian ziggurat that we're looking at here actually has three staircase entrances. This one that you can't quite see in this shot going along the wall on the opposite side. You can see it better in this recreation here, which has the completed temple. One of the things that's most remarkable in the Neo-Sumerian era is the level to which the records of their culture are inscribed into sculptural form. This is one of the rulers of one of the cities of is Guda, and Guda had multiple sculptures made honoring himself and his record of the things that, including temples, and that's what you see here. He's actually holding on his lap a plan for the temple that this statue would have been found of. There's all kinds of cuneiform writing on his skirt as well that sort of describes the need for keeping records, the needs for his deeds and his architectural plans, and also discussing the types of materials that he preferred to be used. He specifically didn't want statues to be made of shinier materials like gold or silver. He really favored this particular dark material, diorite. It's interesting to think about the stonework in Mesopotamia, that stone is not particularly plentiful in these river valley areas and had to be. This is a culture that had a system of communicating beyond just the cities themselves, that there was control from the cities to the outlying region, and that goods were traded and shipped back and forth. It's interesting to know as well. Obviously, he would originally have had his head. That's the thinnest area of the sculpture. He's otherwise a very solid form. Similar to our votive figures, he has his hands against his chest. If the arms were extended away from the body, it would make them a little bit easier to damage. And you can see that the things that do extend, like the knees, the parts that have suffered damage over time. These are other images of Gudea, and there are several of them that have been from ancient Sumeria. He pretty much always looks the same, very much emphasized eyebrow ridge and large, attentive eyes. Is depicted in this very composed way, holding his hands very closely to his chest. He seems to be a very calm, trustworthy leader. This is one of my personal favorites in some ways because it has this really fanciful outpouring water that flows in a couple of streams, and if you look closely you can even see that there are fish in that water. So perhaps he's showing you the reason why he should be a ruler is that he provides prosperity and food and wealth to his people. Kind of. Moving into our Babylonian era, as Babylon rises, we have the first record of written of human culture. This is another stele, very similar in some respects to the stele that we saw of Naram-Sin. The difference being that this one doesn't depict a battle, but depicts the right of the king to rule. So you see Hammurabi's law code, and there's something like 300 on this object. That's what all of this textured area is. Here is all writing that depicts, or that describes rather, types of crimes that might be committed and what the punishments would be. That's always the form the laws are written in. If blank happens, blank is the punishment. It's basically the form the laws take. The object itself, the stele, is really quite tall. It is over average human height. It's over 7 feet in height. That relief section is just over 2 feet worth of the 7-foot tall object. Is being honored by this piece. And so when I first saw it as a student, I assumed that Hammurabi was the one seated on the throne, which is actually incorrect. Hammurabi is not that figure. But we talked about hierarchy of scale. Clearly the figure on the throne, if it stood up, would be bigger, more powerful. So who's bigger and more powerful than the king? The only thing bigger and more powerful than the king would have to be the gods. And so that's actually what you're seeing there, is that the god that he's praying to is essentially a sun god, Shamash, and Shamash is handing him a scepter and a ring, which will be his earthly symbols of his power. You can see that there even seems to be what look maybe like wings, rays of light radiating outward from the god. He is so powerful that he has multiple horns on his hat, but he is clearly showing his approval for Hammurabi to be the ruler by handing him these symbols. And it's a fascinating object in that it creates a connection between visual art making, visual symbols, religion clearly, but also a connection to authority or to law. All of these things are kind of combined together. So for a lot of the cultures that we'll look at, especially in Mesopotamia and into ancient Egypt, a lot of art making is not really just for pure enjoyment of visual decorations. What we're seeing more than anything is a purpose for the art, almost propagandistic, to teach us about the culture and to show us the power of the rulers. Not that you have to know them all, but among the 300 laws that on this stele are the ones that I've selected for you here. And you can see how the setup of the laws work. If anyone is caught, he shall be put to death. It tells you the crime, and then it tells you the punishment. But you may have be more familiar with these laws: eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, Law 196 and Law 200. These are the ones that are biblically referenced, and their actual wording is, of another man, his eye shall be put out. It gives you that cause and effect kind of feeling. The next culture to rise will be the Assyrians, followed by a second revival of the Babylonian culture. The Assyrian Empire becomes really quite large, although it will not be the largest of the cultures of the ancient world. We'll see that in a moment. The Assyrians, though, are relatively better remembered for terms of their military power and a certain degree of violence in the artwork, and it does change quite a bit from what we've seen so far. These are relief decorated the palace of one of the kings, Ashurnasirpal II, and this is pretty typical of the work of the Assyrians. It's relatively low relief, meaning that the objects are not projecting at a great degree of distance from the wall. A low relief object that you're familiar with would be like the a president on a coin. It is somewhat three-dimensional, but it doesn't stick out a great deal from its background. The Assyrians created these walled and protected cities with ziggurats and palaces inside them. This is the Citadel of Sargon II, who was one of the rulers of the Assyrian Empire. And most of the gates themselves, the gates are enormous, but even at the smallest level of those gates, these would have been much larger. But you can see a human being here standing next to these guardian figures at the entrances to the gates. These are collectively known as Lamasu. The Lamasu from the Citadel of Sargon II is a kind of amazing here. He's meant to be seen from two different points of view. If you see him head on, he seems to be standing quite still. You see the forelegs of this kind of amalgamation of a bull and a human being, and we've seen that image multiple times already. The Lamasu, though, go even further. They actually have wings. Section is along the side of the body and projecting toward the back. If you were to stand inside the gate and look at it from this angle, you would see four legs. 1, 2, 3, 4. So ironically, the figure has 5 legs altogether, although you wouldn't really see all 5 at once. It's meant to be seen as standing still from the forefront and walking or striding forward from the side. You can see again the horns on the feathers at the top as well. And you can imagine how enormous the objects are and how much larger the gates themselves are. These are meant to give you a sense both of fear of the power of the king, but also the feeling of safety. If you're in the kingdom, then you certainly enemy, then you certainly feel the fear of the power of that ruler. Some of the most remarkable of the artwork of the Assyrians comes to us from a palace at Nineveh. This is the palace of Ashurbanipal. And Ashurbanipal's main carvings that we'll see here, these reliefs from his palace, depict kind of a ceremonial, but a very important ceremonial experience that would be part of the life of the court. The lion hunt is, at first glance, the king out in the wilderness hunting perhaps for food, but in fact, types of ceremonies, the ceremonial hunt, would have taken place in an arena. It's somewhat a staged event. The only person who's actually allowed to kill the lion would be the king, and he can have a little bit of help in doing so, but he is symbolically destroying chaos. What you're seeing are wild lions that have been caught, brought to the arena, forced into that space, and then the king in front of him symbolically kills them, and that's what you're seeing taking place here. This is another example not only of the power of the king being depicted in carving, but also again a kind of disconnect between the expressiveness of the wild world and the rigidity and stability of the real world. If you look at the way the king is depicted and his helpers, he's much more upright and rigid than the figures of the defeated lions. Some of the realism in these pieces is really incredible. When you look at the sort of snarl in the face of the lioness, you can see blood pouring from the wounds. You can see her back legs even have been paralyzed. It's a remarkable level of what we might call realism or naturalism in the art, that it is from such an ancient culture. It really is kind of remarkable to think that the image of the king needs to be propagandistic, needs to stand the test of time, needs to seem perfect and immovable, but the images of the rest of the world around them can be much more chaotic. It is also interesting that the Assyrian culture makes its way into more contemporary times. This is a painting by the Romantic era painter Delacroix, a painting based on a poem by Romantic British poet Lord Byron that was about an Assyrian king. So you're seeing here, even in popular culture, in literature, and then being made into art, this obsession that our culture will continue to have the world of Mesopotamia, with the world of the Assyrians in particular. The story that's happening here is that the king, Sardanapalus, is facing certain defeat, and rather than have his harem and his animals and soldiers be taken by an invading army to death, so he symbolically destroys all of his worldly goods so that the invaders cannot have them. When Babylon rises, we have really one of the most remarkable cities in the ancient world. This is all under the auspices of Nebuchadnezzar. You'll be familiar probably from Bible studies. Nebuchadnezzar sees to it that his walled city is one of the most impressive in the history of the world. In fact, the gate is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, as are his hanging gardens of Babylon. So what you're seeing here is sort of reproduction of what the city of Babylon would have looked like at its height. The city itself is built in 2 sections on either river, and it includes the king's palace and here this remarkable ziggurat. When you look at the gates itself, known as the Ishtar Gates in honor of the goddess Ishtar, who of course is both goddess of love and of war, what you're seeing is very brightly colored. It's very clearly got this elaborate blue work, and that blue comes from copper that's being infused into the material. The Ishtar Gate is also pretty remarkable in that it is enormous. What you're seeing here is the smaller section which would have stood in front of a much taller section, and even here a human being is going to be really dwarfed by this smaller exterior gate. You see a series of animals represented on the gate. They are alternating bull figures and then this kind of Babylonian dragon figure. It sort of has the neck and head of a serpent. It seems to have talons on the back legs, which seems somewhat like or a bird, and the forelegs seem to have a relationship to the figure of a lion, so a very particular type of fierce creature. These figures alternate in horizontal bands. You can see every other band going up this direction. When you look at them up close and you see how those figures made up and the figures of lions along what's known as the processional way leading up to the gate, you can imagine at first glance that they're just painted, but they are in relief, and these are actually made of glazed brick. Each one of those individual bricks is handmade and then so that they create this relief form of the body of each of those animals projecting forward. So rather than being carved out of stone, these are hand built specifically to make those forms. They're really pretty remarkable. The last culture that we'll look at in era is perhaps the most impressive in terms of just the size of the region that it controls. The Persian Empire is an empire that at its height is the largest that the world had ever seen, and the height of this empire is about 200 years of ruling a massive amount of territory into what is, of course, today India, throughout the Mesopotamian region that we've been looking at, and heading ancient Greece and including Egypt as well. So the Persian Empire is really one of the most remarkable and expansive that we can have an enormous amount of information about that culture because one of its most important artifacts was completely destroyed. This is perhaps the most important city in the ancient world, and it doesn't look impressive now as it would have been. This is Persepolis, which was burned by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, who's Macedonian of Greece, and then begins to control and dominate almost the entirety of what had been the Persian Empire. And when he finally reaches Persepolis, the ancient seat of power of the Persian kings, he hosts a feast for his victorious soldiers, and then they up furniture and other wooden objects and burn the city to the ground. The city would have been built on terraces, and the palace had ceilings, so that's why it was able to be burned. The ceilings were not stone. Really impossible to kind of imagine the grand might have looked like. So there's a video in your discussion board that recreates what Persepolis would have looked like, so you get a sense of the glory that has been destroyed. Ironically, the burning of the city is probably what helped preserve some of the artwork that we're seeing. There were relief everywhere throughout the palaces. This particular section is the audience hall of the last kings of the Persian Empire in this phase, Darius, and you can see Darius receiving tributes. The main purpose of this section of the palace would have been receiving gifts of various kinds, tribute from the areas that were controlled under the Persian Empire. Now, the Persians, a relatively benign form of rulership. They allowed people to maintain their own traditional religious beliefs, culture, language, as long as they paid their taxes and monetary tributes to the Persian king. And so that's kind of what allowed them to control as vast and as multi-ethnic an empire as they were able to control. You can really see some of the connections, though, to the artwork we've seen throughout the Mesopotamian world. You can see that the hair is very stylized in both the hair and the beard. You can also see that the eyes are really highly emphasized. Things that's kind of remarkable, though, is that in the Persian carvings, you can actually detect the different cultures themselves. You can tell certain of the figures from Africa. You can see figures that come from all throughout this massive amount of territory that was controlled by the Persians. More remarkable things that remain are the capitals, the top of the columns that held up those roofs. They're carved to look like help to support the ceiling beams. The empire of the Persians, although it is vast and it lasts for a couple hundred years, is brought low by the invading army of Alexander the Great when Persepolis is burned. The people, of course, existed, and eventually they rise a second time, and that's known as the Assyrian Empire, the second big phase of Persian culture. And here you see them actually defeating Roman emperors and taking tribute from them. So the culture does incorporate in architecture that we'll learn about when we study ancient Rome. You can see this vaulted ceiling of the great palace of Shapur I. He is one of this second phase of the Persian Empire. Notice how much later in time we are. This is now circa 250 BCE, before the Common Era. Palace near Baghdad has one of the tallest vaulted audience chambers that the ancient world would ever see. He also incorporated this very decorative element. This is what we know as a blind arcade. These are openings that are actually false. They are not openings that have a function like doors or windows, but arched areas that are really purely decorative. A series of arches like this is known as a blind arcade.